Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about associations. The main objectives for this chapter are to discuss racial segregation due to associations, structures and systems, responses to discrimination, racial discrepancies in civic participation, hate groups, the internet as a source of virtual racism and multiracial coalition building, and religious life. When we're delving into this chapter, we need to really be understanding institutions that structure our life and how they are racially dominated by whites historically. For example, when you look at economics, the institutions, the corporations, the CEOs tend to be white males. When you look at religious institutions, again, women and other minorities were historically discriminated against. Elite social positions. When you look at the institutions such as education, you have to ask questions as to who is getting the education, who historically had access to education, was there racial segregation in education? And then when you're looking at the organizations, again, you're looking at all the different lobby groups, all the different value systems and beliefs that are structured by institutions, not only with churches and education systems, but also civic associations that are then associated with politics and political power. And again, so the arena of politics, along with economics and, education system and the family and other institutions, again, politics historically have been dominated by white males also. Again, women were not allowed to vote, were not considered citizens of the United States until after the Civil War. Other minorities were slaves, 3/5 of a person. Again, so this subjugation of European white males, of women and other minorities is something that's been going on for centuries. And again, this is kind of where we're at when we start to look at institutional discrimination, because you realize that your race is associated with whether or not you're able to gain access to elite social positions and rise up the social class ladder, okay? But a lot of this is culturally constructed. Again, America historically was a male, white dominated place. Again, white being a term for European descent, essentially. And again, white by the Supreme Court is not a race. It is, again, an ethnicity, very clearly defined by the Supreme Court as an ethnicity, a pan-ethnicity, because it's a grouping of people from across the world. And again, you have to ask questions like, how did white people gain power over organizations, and how does their social interaction create segregation to an extent that other people are discriminated against, okay? So after the Reconstruction, racial slavery was supplanted by racial segregation. Just because people were granted freedom in America didn't mean that people socially interacted between races. Okay, so you had a lot of the endogamy, the marriage within races, friends within races, your associations, your co-workers all tend to be similar races. The neighborhoods you lived in tend to be racially segregated, and along with the institutions of society. Not only racially segregated, but also ethnically segregated. And I really love studying the history of, migrant patterns in urban development in New York and Chicago, and just seeing where people move. And you can go to the different ethnic neighborhoods as you drive through, and it's clearly ethnically segregated. And the book talks about all kinds of reasons for this. Again, but people that share a common culture, share a common language, a common way of life. And, if you're coming to a new country and you don't speak the language, for example, right, when you get here, it's great to have those connections, because that's how you get set up and are able to make a good life for yourself. So again, you had ethnically segregated neighborhoods in America that still exist to this day, and that's why we had the whole discussion in housing about how neighborhoods are segregated. Membership in society, again, historically meant being white, male, and Christian, and not even just Christian, but Protestant. Again, Catholics also were discriminated against in America, okay? In response to the dominance of white males, again, you had other ethnic organizations binding together and creating their own associations so that they have people to advocate for, you know what I mean? And so you had African American societies sprouting up in response. You had the rise of ethnic nationalism like Italian pride. You had the rise of organizations dedicated to the community and improvement of non-white males. You had people going into the cities and trying to help other minorities that weren't taken care of by the law and often forgotten. And then you had the civil rights movement that eventually forced integration of social institutions, such as the book talking about the Boy Scouts. But again, the segregation between races and ethnicities is something that's been a historical structure of America. And it's only in recent times that we're really trying to rethink this and kind of overcome white domination. And again, white domination came from war. Again, England won the war. There's no other way to put it. So England won the war, and women had already been discriminated against. So all England did was just discriminated against women and anyone that wasn't, from England and it wasn't a Protestant, and then those people were subjugated in society. And it's only now in modern times that we're starting to deal with the consequences of that, and we're restarting to question, well, the British Empire doesn't really exist anymore. Should we still have this dominant, racially dominant system, or should we change the system? And that's where we're at now. We're challenging this system, and we're like, look, it's just not fair. And for white males to continue to maintain power and to discriminate against others based upon prejudice, maybe it's time that we rethink that. And so that's something that's been happening, especially since the civil rights movement, that's continuing into modern times. Civics and race. So again, whites have higher participation rates when it comes to politics and involvement in organizations. And you have to ask questions why. And again, a lot of it just simply has to do with economics. Those that are more affluent tend to be more interacted and with these institutions by joining organizations and lobbying and becoming representatives and senators. And again, and so you've seen those white males in privileged positions in all the institutions of society for hundreds of years. And it's only now in modern times that this has been challenged. But again, it's also a rich white males that are in these, affluent positions. And then the middle class and the rich tend to get more involved than the people that are poor. Therefore, civics and a civic association is highly associated with economic factors, which is really sad, though, because there's more poor people. So if more of the poor people came out and got involved in the civic organizations, they could change the laws to make it work better for them. For example, I read a book one time about if white and black people had gotten together pre-World War I when they were drafting people in, then, not so many poor people would have gotten drafted. They could have, voted in different ways and changed the way that was done. But white and black people couldn't get together to even vote together that were poor. And if they had, they would have had more power with each other. So again, much of civics and race, civic involvement in society, interacting with the organizations and institutions, whether it's politics or government or church associations, education associations, hobby associations, whatever it might be, you see this experience of dominant culture versus subjugating of minorities. Again, the dominant culture, which was historically British, white, Protestant, male with money and a high social class, they had the ones with all the power, therefore the ones that have historically held the dominant positions in society. Institutional discrimination exists. All you have to do is look at the statistics to prove it. And we do all kinds of studies that show, a white male with a bachelor's will be hired over a black male with a PhD, and it just goes on down the line like that. Again, 3 white people would get called before a black-sounding name gets called. In modern times, we do have this political correctness movement, and again, this has started, with the idea of changing the words and the words that we use in society to be less discriminatory in our word use. And again, changing our attitudes about prejudice and having more positive attitudes toward all people, not just people of your same race, for example. So you've seen this stretch, and your book talks about that a little bit to conclude that part of the chapter. When it comes to hate groups are increasing, and hate groups are simply defined as organized racism. When you ask the question, who joins hate groups, you might think it's just poor, uneducated white people that live in rural areas. But again, the book talks about that it's spread across the board. Institutionalized racism, prejudice, negative attitudes toward different races and ethnicities has always been a part of American history. I mean, everyone knows the stereotypical words about every ethnicity and race, and even if you have never said them in your life. You've still been socialized to know the words. And again, this is where negative bias comes from. It's a socialized process that has been, reproduced from generation to generation, this culture of racism and sexism and ethnocentrism and heterosexism, okay? In modern times, the book credits the internet as a common median because the internet is a place where you can go and be anonymous and spout off whatever you want and all your negativity. It's used for both hate and positive social change, though, because, again, it's not just, the hate crimes when it comes to like hate speech and negative attitudes toward races and ethnicities is much less common than positive attitudes and nice, happy thoughts. But still, the hate groups exist, and this is just that all comes from just negative attitudes. But I tend to scoff at the hate groups a little bit because most of them don't do their research. And again, I remind people that, like, people who say things like the Aryan race. Guys, Aryans are from Iran. So whenever you hear those neo-Nazis in America talking about the Aryan race, they're really saying the greatest people on earth are Iranians. And you know what? Iranians are great. So all people on earth are great. Iranians are great. But I don't think the white people really know that they're trying to say that they're Persian. But that's what they're saying. They're like, that's the Persian pride I'm all for. But again, they misinterpret these words because they didn't do their homework very well. Again, I always point at Hitler and I always say, Hitler didn't do his homework. He didn't have the internet. If Hitler had the internet, he could have researched the word Aryan, and I bet he would have changed his words. Religion and race. The book points this out, but most people's religious attitudes and values are socialized by other people. People don't historically go in and actually read the books and do the research themselves. And so the book basically says most people believe in these religious ideologies, but they've never read the book themselves. Religious intolerance exists in America, and that's something we have to recognize, whether it was being anti-Catholic, anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish. And there's a lot of examples of this in history. Again, there's only been 2 Catholic presidents. Why? When the Jewish people were trying to escape Germany during World War II and they came over to America on boats, what did America do but send them back to Germany? And so then they ended up back in Auschwitz instead of just letting them in the country. It's a negative story, but what can you do? That's the history. We have to talk about it, but this is why we have to improve our attitudes. After 9/11, you had a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment. You had some anti-Arab sentiment going way back, especially in the 60s during the Arab rights movement when people were really pushing for more positive attitudes toward Arabs. And again, why were the Jewish people blamed for killing Jesus when it was actually the Romans who killed Jesus? Just a whole lot of questions. But a big thing to understand is the association between race, ethnicity, and religion, in that your race and your ethnicity are associated with your religion. For example, if you're born in India, what kind of religion are you likely to be? Are you going to be more likely to be Catholic, or are you going to be more likely to be Hindu? And if you're born in China, what religion are you more likely to be? Are you going to be Confucius, or are you going to be Buddhist? If you're born in America, what religion are you likely to be? So much of geography is associated with your actual religion, and so much of geography is then associated with how racial categories are constructed in the United States, because the U.S. Census bases your race based upon the country of origin, for example, and same thing with your ethnicity. And then the association between race and the associations themselves is that the places of worship tend to be highly segregated. And so when you look at Christian churches, for example, are there black churches and white churches? And how many churches are actually integrated in the grand scheme? And the book says, yes, there are multiracial and integrated churches. However, at the same time, do you see a lot of diversity in the churches? Okay, and so you have to ask the questions that even the church, is that segregated? Even the mosques, are those segregated? And then, for example, historically, if you were Jewish, they were kind of anti-marrying outside, the group. So endogamous marriage and for being Jewish in the United States was a big factor. But now in modern times, they've had to open the door, if only just for more genetic diversity. And again, this is another reason I point holes at Hitler, is that if, all humans are the same, then one thing can wipe you out, which is like why the Great Potato Famine happened, right? In Ireland, they planted only one type of potato, and then a disease came and wiped out all the potatoes, for example. So these are just some things you need to be thinking about. And genetic diversity is imperative. So, everyone mixing all over from all countries creates incredible diversity that one disease is not likely to wipe everyone out. 95% of Native Americans died from diseases, but 5% survived. Now, that's a really sad history, but at the same time, 5% had the immunity. So again, without that genetic diversity, what would happen? Thank you very much.